The Transcendental Universe by C. G. Harrison. Lecture 1. Science, or systematized knowledge, is of three kinds: physical, mental, and spiritual. Physical science deals with external phenomena, mental science with the truths about relations such as number, position, and motion, and spiritual science with the truths of harmony, an eternal principle in nature, to which the art of music is an endeavour to give symbolic expression through the medium of vibrations in the atmosphere, having a definite numerical relation to each other. Spiritual science is frequently called occult science. The term has been much abused, chiefly on account of its connection with certain arts such as divination, necromancy, witchcraft, and especially modern spiritualism, which is neither an art nor a science, but a dangerous playing with edged tools. Such arts may be and are practised with as little knowledge of occult science as a telegraph clerk need possess of the science of electrical engineering. But there is a science founded on a knowledge, more or less perfect, of the laws which govern the spiritual region of causes, which has been handed down for centuries by oral tradition, and jealously guarded from the vulgar by an elaborate symbolism so contrived as to answer the double purpose of concealment from the unworthy and suggestiveness, whereby those who have developed the faculty of spiritual discernment up to a certain point may be stimulated to further inquiry. The reason for this secrecy is that the knowledge in question is the key to a power which would be highly dangerous to society, as at present constituted, if it were to become public property. The spiritual region is, as I've just said, the world of cause. What are called natural forces have their origin on the same plane of existence as the human will, for between man and the universe there is a mysterious correspondence. The foundation, or substance as the schoolmen called it, of matter is force, and the spiritual force of man's individuality being the ultimate objective force in nature, it can analyse and dissolve all secondary chemical and mechanical forces. Given a certain kind of knowledge, it is possible to develop, by training, powers latent in every individual, which would be so many weapons in the hands of unscrupulous persons that would enable them to commit crimes without the least fear of detection. Such a state of things would inaugurate a reign of terror that would shake society to its foundations. This indeed once actually happened. The traditions preserved among all nations of a universal flood are a witness to this catastrophe. There is a certain periodic law of cataclysms which comes into operation under such circumstances, and to a great extent neutralizes the evil, as will be explained in a succeeding lecture. It is, however, impossible to guard the fortress of spiritual science at all points, and a breach once made is very easily widened, for sciences have a tendency to overlap one another. Chemistry, for example, which is a physical science, has, for some time past, received in its highest branches valuable aid from mathematics or pure mental science. The discovery of the rare metal gallium is a case in point. Mr. Mendeleeff of St. Petersburg had predicted from a study of the atomic numbers of the elements that a metal would be found to fill a vacant place in the series, and gave its probable specific gravity, which agrees closely with the results of the experiments at Paris with gallium. In the same way, it is now almost past praying for that our physical scientists will continue to ignore the phenomena of the séance room and the latest developments of hypnotism. Directly these become subjects of investigation by a large number of trained observers for the purpose of ascertaining the relation they bear to the mystery of life and mind, what relation, for example, electric conditions set up by the action of the human will bear towards similar conditions in inorganic substances, it is almost impossible that certain natural forces should fail to be discovered, and the methods by which they may be manipulated, which our scientific men, in accordance with their usual custom, will immediately make public. This will constitute a serious danger, but one which it is impossible to avoid. Accordingly, it has been deemed advisable by some who possess the key to the higher knowledge to impart to those who choose to receive them certain facts, until lately kept secret, because they were part of a secret whole, which, until quite recently, there existed no special reason for making known. Of the reasons for this decision, and the causes which have led up to it, I propose now to treat. Occultists are divided into practical and theoretical. With practical occultism, or the science of magic, these lectures do not profess to deal. It is necessary to state, however, that there are two kinds of magic, white and black. The subject of black magic is too revolting for anything but the briefest mention. The nearest approach in the universe to anything like the popular conception of a devil is the black magician. When I say that the torture of animals is recommended as an excellent training for developing the faculties essential to the successful practice of black magic, I shall probably give you a better idea of its nature than any actual description of its horrible rites would convey. Though, in regard to these, I may say that if, per impossible, I could bring myself to repeat in English the words of a certain incantation, said to be of Moorish origin, though in bastard Latin, it would have the effect of clearing the room in 5 minutes. White magic is the ministry of healing, not only of physical, but mental and moral disease. It must not be supposed, however, that the practical occultist is, que occultist, a doctor, a philosopher, or a minister of religion. He may be each and all of these, and in other ages and countries combined and monopolize the three. But his real work is on the higher planes of causes. It is very difficult to convey to the uninitiated a clear idea of the nature of an operation in white magic. It is something like a religious function. Indeed, the religious functions of the Church were sometimes utilized for the purpose on the continent, until the ecclesiastical authorities discovered and put a stop to it from jealousy and a wish to keep all spiritual power in their own hands. The ritual of the higher magic differs, however, in several important respects from any esoteric function, and writers like Eliphas Levi may be searched in vain for any information in regard to the actual essentials, which are never committed to writing. Le dogme et rituel de la haute magique is nevertheless a monument of learning from an historical point of view, and contains many curious details in connection with evil, or at any rate, doubtful operations which constitute its chief interest. At least so I am given to understand, for I am not myself a practical occultist. I am also informed that of late years the ritual has been much simplified. The dramatic element, if I may use the expression, which at one time had its use, has almost disappeared, and with it all the paraphernalia of robes, crossed swords, and barren verbiage. The place of the swords has been taken by pointed copper rods, which are found to answer the purpose better, while Turkish baths and Jaeger clothing are amply sufficient for all purposes of cleanliness. But ceremonial magic is only practised by certain orders, and resorted to in exceptional circumstances. It is attended with considerable danger to the intellect, and in all white brotherhoods is discouraged, and in some forbidden under pain of expulsion, for the reason that it exposes to a peculiar form of temptation, viz., to suicide. A practical occultist usually belongs to a brotherhood, and I am given to understand that many of them are members of the higher orders of Freemasons, and constitute in that body an imperium in imperio. There are also those who belong to religious orders in the Roman Catholic Church, notably the Jesuits, to which they stand in the same relation as the others to the Freemasons. Between these and the last named there is war to the knife, and each accuses the other of following the left-hand path. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule. I know myself one practical occultist who is unattached, but the advantages of cooperation are so great that nearly every practical occultist, unless he has given himself up to the practice of evil arts, is a member of some one or other more or less strict fraternity. A theoretical occultist, on the other hand, is not necessarily a member of an esoteric brotherhood, though of course many of them are. There are numbers of self-initiated persons in this country, for various reasons precluded from taking the steps necessary to attain proficiency in practical occultism, who are yet in intimate relation with those who have, and whose companionship and even advice are sought and welcomed by those who are taking an active part in the combat behind the veil. Occultists, both practical and theoretical, may be divided into three parties: esoterics, liberals, and brothers of the left. In one sense, of course, every occultist is an esoteric, in the same way that every politician, however advanced, provided he stops short of actual nihilism, is a conservative. No one who has passed the dweller on the threshold could ever be tempted to reveal the secret of the threshold, for only a madman would soar off the branch on which he sits. It is the knowledge that pertains to the region beyond about which there are differences of opinion as to how much it is prudent to reveal. Much of this knowledge it would be a plain duty to communicate to the world, if we were sure it would not be misused. Certain facts connected with human generation it would be useful for everyone to know. Many of the evils which spring from ignorance of the causes of disease might be easily averted, and the diseases themselves removed without recourse to drugs. Much time and labour might be saved if the ratio of consonant etheric vibrations were known, and our skilful machinations thus in a position to avail themselves of nature's finer forces. But the trouble is that none of these things could be revealed by themselves. The mystery of birth and death is a key to the portals of an unseen world inhabited by man's most deadly foes, deadly on account of the sympathy which exists between his lower and their higher nature, constituting a fatal bond of attraction wholly evil in its effects on humanity. In the same way, the knowledge of how to cure disease cannot be separated from the knowledge of how to produce it, and it is a very grave question whether on the whole the diffusion of this knowledge would be a blessing or a curse as society is at present constituted. And the same argument applies with enormous forces to placing in the hands of the rich a power which would enable them to dispense with 9/10 of the labour which at present ministers to their wants, and at the same time provide them with the means of instantly crushing any hostile demonstration on the part of the unemployed majority, who would then be entirely at their mercy. Such a power in the hands of a few individuals would inaugurate a state of things too appalling to contemplate. Extribus desi omnes. The party of secrecy among occultists is a very strong case. It is not from pride, or the love of mystery for its own sake, far less is it from mere churlish selfishness, that they hold the key of knowledge with so tenacious a grasp. I am not an esoteric myself, otherwise I should not deliver these lectures, but though I yield to none as to the importance of discretion, I am unable to agree with many persons whom I hold in the highest respect as to the wisdom of continuing the policy of total silence, until lately preserved, in regard to the very existence in these days of such a science as occultism, and with what I cannot help calling the Jesuitical practice of siding with the Philistines against medieval superstitions in the public press. Being unattached, I consider myself at liberty to express my opinion freely on this point. There is what may be called a liberal party among occultists, and like the liberal party in politics, it is accused by the conservatives of departing from the principles of the liberals of a generation ago. Liberalism has been defined as trust in the people tempered with discretion, and its opposite, mistrust of the people tempered by fear. The definition is, on the whole, a sound one, and if the political liberals of the last generation would now be called conservatives, The liberal occultists of 50 years ago were certainly esoteric so far as the policy of total secrecy was concerned. But the times were different. The gross materialism of the first half of the 19th century had to be destroyed before any instruction could be conveyed. Accordingly, the efforts of the liberals of the last generation were concentrated on the indirect production of the phenomena known as modern spiritualism. The agitation for the repeal of the Corn Laws, which took place in the political world about the same time, was not much hotly conducted than the conflict behind the vow on the question of spiritualism. Those who were in favour of this experiment on modern habits of thought were denounced as brothers of the left and even black magicians, in the same way that Bright and Cobden were reviled as levellers, atheists and enemies of society generally. I regret to say that the results in the political and the occult world have not been the same. The esoterics have triumphed, and the psychical research societies bewail in the dearth of phenomena and the rarity of genuine mediums. There is yet a third party among occultists who are called by their opponents brothers of the left, i.e. the left-hand path, and sometimes brothers of the shadow, which last name has given rise to the curious mistake of confounding them with black magicians. The true black magician is almost unknown in Europe, though the practice of evil arts is, I regret to say, far from uncommon, especially by amateurs. But the black magician is an Ishmael among occultists. His hand is against every man, and every man's hand is against him. There are no black brotherhoods, for there can be no mutual confidence between men who are wholly self-centred. A brother of the shadow is something quite different from the individual with the red fillet in Mrs. Campbell Praed's Shilling Shocker. The shadow has nothing to do with shady morals. It is, to speak plainly, the papacy, the shadow, or ghost, as Gibbon calls it, of the old Roman Empire. Under its baleful influence, the sense of individual responsibility withers. Right and wrong become synonymous with obedience and disobedience to the spiritual authority, and among the Jesuits we have the sad spectacle of the highest knowledge and the noblest powers perverted into instruments for obtaining an unfair advantage in the conduct of political intrigues, often in themselves of a very questionable character, which had for their object the re-establishment of the temporal power of the Pope. I do not doubt for a moment that they are honest in their belief that this is necessary for the spiritual welfare of Europe, but the doctrine that the end justifies the means is a doctrine of the shadow, not of the light. But of course all brothers of the left are not Jesuits, though these are the most powerful and important. Without entering into further details, suffice it to say that the term is used to designate practical occultists who devote their energies to the promotion of objects which have for their aim the interests of the few rather than the good of humanity in general. I shall have occasion to refer to them again in connection with the Theosophical movement. For the present I wish to say a few words in connection with the phenomena of the séance room, what is known as modern spiritualism. It has an unfortunate history. About the year 1840, the nations of modern Europe touched a certain point in their evolutionary cycle called the point of physical intellectuality. One of these crises had arrived which necessitated immediate action of some kind on the part of those who keep watch over the sign of the times. For, in the life of nations, there is a periodic ebb and flow of tendency, alternate periods of intellectual and spiritual evolution of varying strength. This variation is subject to a law of increase and diminution in a constant ratio for each, which I will endeavour to explain in a future lecture. At the period of which I am speaking, the spiritual evolution was proceeding at its minimum, and the intellectual at its maximum rate, and a strong current had set in towards materialism in all departments of human activity. Now the great danger of materialism is the adoption of a utilitarian standard of goodness and intellectual evolution. Under these conditions, is spiritual involution or death. It became therefore a serious question with occultists, 1. How far they were justified in concealing longer the fact that there is an unseen world around us as real as the world of sense, and 2. How this could be revealed with safety. In other words, how could a safe course be steered between Scala and Charybdis? It was admitted on all hands that something must be done, but the party of secrecy were averse to a straightforward policy of tentative elementary instruction. Let us proceed cautiously, they said in effect, and endeavour to ascertain indirectly how far the public is disposed to receive such instruction. Accordingly, experiments were made first in America, then in France, and afterward in England, with certain individuals of a peculiar psychical organisation, since called mediums. But the whole thing was a failure. The mediums, one and all, declared that they were controlled by spirits who had departed from the earth. It was just what might have been expected, said those who were always wise after the event, but in point of fact no one had expected it. I can only account for this strange oversight by the fact that the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light. The occultists were like the man in the fable who was so absorbed in the contemplation of the stars that he walked into the ditch at his feet. As, under the circumstances, the spiritualists could not be undeceived as to the source of their inspirations, there was no alternative but to withdraw from the experiment. But the mischief was done. The door had been opened to extra-mundane influences and could not be reclosed. Spiritualism was a Frankenstein monster, and a Proteus into the bargain. Mediumship, especially in America, became a profession, and mediums, subject to every kind of psychic influence, were largely exploited by brothers of the left for their own purposes. The party of secrecy were almost wholly employed in endeavouring to counteract these influences, with the assistance of many who called themselves liberals, quite a new name by the way, when an event occurred which united both parties in defence against a common danger. A person who was known to exist, but who had not been discovered, suddenly appeared in Paris, presented herself at an occult lodge, and demanded admission into the brotherhood on terms which could not be entertained for a moment. She then disappeared, and the next thing that was heard was that a certain Madame Blavatsky had been expelled from an American brotherhood for an offence against the Constitution of the United States, and had gone to British India in order to carry out a certain threat which it would seem there was a fair prospect of her putting into execution. It is only within the last few months, 1893, that I learned the details of this Homeric struggle in which poor Madame Blavatsky played the part of Patroclus in the armour of Achilles. Like Patroclus, she spread consternation at first, but was soon metaphorically slain, or rather taken prisoner. Then it was that the real battle began, and for several years raged around her unhappy personality. But as I am not at liberty to make unrestricted use of the information I received, the best way will be to read an extract from a report which I drew up at the time with the view, since abandoned, of putting it in the hands of the newspaper readers in the form of an interview. In order to make it more easily comprehended, I use political terms such as liberal, conservative, coalition ministry, etc., which I need hardly say must only be taken in a figurative sense. The first part, it will be observed, covers ground we have already traversed. Our conversation having turned on the Theosophical movement in Europe and America, I gathered the following information. 1. That the phenomena of the seance room are not due to the spirits of the dead, but of the living. That modern spiritualism is an experiment on modern civilization decided on, about 50 years ago, by a federation of occult brotherhoods for the purpose of testing its vitality and ascertaining whether it is capable of receiving new truths without danger. 2. That there are what may be called a liberal and conservative party among occultists, and that the rank and file are strongly conservative, though about 2/3 of the leaders are more or less inclined to liberalism. and that owing to the preponderance of conservative opinion, spiritualism is about to receive a severe blow which will have the effect of throwing discredit on phenomena generally. 3. That the aspect of the heavens at the time of the birth of Madame Blavatsky frightened the conservatives and resulted in a kind of coalition ministry which gave place to a liberal one in the year 1841. 4. That a brother of the left revealed this fact to Madame Blavatsky in Egypt about 20 years ago, that she returned to Europe immediately and imposed certain terms as a condition of reception into an occult brotherhood in Paris, which were indignantly refused, that she was subsequently received in America and expelled very shortly afterwards. 5. That on consequence of a threat from Madame Blavatsky that she would soon make the American brotherhood shut up shop, a conference of American and European occultists was held at Vienna, and a particular course of action decided upon. 6. That during the time Madame Blavatsky imagined herself to be in Tibet, she was in reality at Kathmandu in the state known to occultists as in prison. 7. That certain Hindu occultists who, for patriotic reasons, having sided with her against the American Brotherhood, had nearly succeeded in procuring her release from prison by their own efforts, consented to a compromise whereby she was to be set free on condition of their non-interference with anything that had been already accomplished. Mr. So-and-so was very severe in his condemnation of these Hindu occultists who preferred the interests of their country to the interests of humanity. 8. That Koot Hoomi is a real person, but is neither a Tibetan nor a Mahatma. He is, said Mr. So-and-so, a treacherous scoundrel in the pay of the Russian government, who for a time succeeded in deceiving Madame Blavatsky, but whose true character and personality she at length discovered. Her chagrin at having been so long hoodwinked caused her a serious illness. But as the Mahatmas were the foundation stone of the Theosophical Society, she was obliged to keep up the deception. She contrived, however, to let Koot Hoomi gradually disappear as the author of phenomena, and substituted for him a mythical Mahatma M, who never appeared in his astral body. 9. That it was the Kiddle incident which first opened her eyes to the trick which had been played on her. 10. That it was Koot Hoomi who subsequently tampered with the Colombes at Agia, in revenge, it is supposed, at the defeat of his machinations. 11. That, incredible as it may seem, she allowed herself to be again deceived after her return to England, this time by a renegade Jew who had been expelled from a continental brotherhood for the practice of evil arts. It was decided not to warn her against this individual, because he was keeping her alive. In her wretched state of health, the withdrawal of the stimulus of his control would have been fatal. The man waited until she had completed the 2nd volume of her secret doctrine, and then threw her over. She succumbed to her next attack, and died in 1891, unsuspicious, far as it is known to the last, and serenely unconscious that she had been all her life at all in the hands of designing persons, very few of whom were her intellectual equals, and who made disgraceful use of her extraordinary mental activity and unique gifts. Now I think it will be admitted that this throws considerable light on a subject hitherto shrouded in mystery. It vindicates Madame Blavatsky from the charge of vulgar imposture, while at the same time it effectually disposes of the Mahatma theory. As for the so-called miracles of the performance of which she is credited, I see no reason to doubt that some of them were genuine exhibitions of occult power, or to deny that others were fraudulent. Nor do I attach very much importance to the moral aspects of the latter. Those who have had any experience of the higher phenomena of spiritualism know how difficult it is to apportion justly the blame which attaches itself equally to medium and control in cases of fraud. For I think that there can be no doubt that Madame Blavatsky was a medium of a very exceptional kind. Her psychic personality was in many respects unique. Early in life she was gifted with the faculty known in Scotland as second sight. Persons of this kind are usually negative, that is to say, they have seldom any strongly marked individual characteristics. But this extraordinary woman, united with the utmost receptivity, a remarkable courage and independence of character. Regardless of the world's opinion, good or bad, she brushed aside social conventions as if they were so many cobwebs. She possessed a vigorous intellect, though not a great one, for she was deficient in the logical faculty. But her capacity for assimilating knowledge was enormous, and I am afraid I must add, the faculty with which she was capable of perverting it to suit her own ends. Like a certain famous statesman who is said to follow his conscience as a coachman follows his horses, viz. By driving them before him, so Madame Blavatsky followed truth by applying to what it is the lash of what she considered ought to be. Withal she was of a most kindly disposition and impulsive generosity, and though destitute of every distinctive feminine quality, possessed the remarkable gift of fascinating all with whom she came in contact. Now, though I am treading on thin ice, I must add a few words in partial explanation of the mysterious phrase imprison. What is occult imprisonment, and why was it inflicted on Madame Blavatsky? There is a certain operation of ceremonial magic by means of which a wall of psychic influences may be built up around an individual who has become dangerous, which has the effect of paralyzing the higher activities and producing what is called the repercussion of effort, and the result is a kind of spiritual sleep characterized by fantastic visions. It is an operation seldom resorted to even by brothers of the left, and in the case of Madame Blavatsky was disapproved of by almost all the European cultists. On the American Brotherhood alone rests the responsibility for what has since happened. The late Mr. Oliphant, I believe, knew more about the affair than any Englishman. However, to cut a long story short, Madame Blavatsky emerged from a prison a Tibetan Buddhist and the prophetess of a new religion. The reappearance of Madame Blavatsky has necessitated a total change of the policy of secrecy hitherto pursued. Whether for good or evil, she has made public an immense mass of information in regard to matters which, until quite recently, were never spoken of outside certain societies, but which is of such a character as to commend itself on its own merits to thoughtful persons from whatever source it may come. For it is the greatest mistake in the world to suppose that Theosophy depends on the evidence for the genuineness of Madame Blavatsky's miracles, or the existence of Mahatmas. Indeed, since the death of Madame Blavatsky in 1891, the policy of the leading Theosophists has been to keep the Mahatmas as much as possible in the background. Mrs. Besant, e.g., who, with far less knowledge than a teacher, possesses over her the great advantage of being able to arrange her thoughts methodically, perceives quite clearly that Theosophy, if it is to succeed, must take possession of the reason and conscience of the 19th century. To this end, she has devoted herself to expounding its doctrines with special reference to their points of contact with orthodox science, and to intellectual and moral problems which modern Christianity has found itself unable to solve in the absence of this kind of knowledge, which is supposed to be the peculiar property of Tibetan adepts. Now that Madame Blavatsky obtained her vast knowledge in the ordinary way of study is out of the question. I believe she spoke the truth when she said it was imparted to her by extraordinary methods. She was, in fact, the medium in the hands of some person or persons unknown, who for reasons of their own have chosen to shelter themselves behind her personality. It really matters very little where she got her almost encyclopedic information. What we have to do is to examine it carefully in the light of knowledge we already possess. For it cannot be denied that while Isis Unveiled contains little that was not known before, the secret doctrine affords most valuable information in regard to prehistoric civilizations and religions, and hints at certain secrets the very existence of which was unsuspected, some of which have been tested by a process known to occultists, and found correct. And though perhaps outside the Theosophical Society not one in 1,000 reads the secret doctrine, or 1 in 10,000 is capable of sifting the wheat from the chaff. It will receive more and more attention as religious thought gradually emancipates itself from Latin influences, and modern scientific discovery from atomic illusions. Start last words of the occult world, not word. Of the occult world, since identified as a namesake of Madame Blavatsky's old nurse Maya. We are not told, but the individual in question required her cooperation in a work he was about to undertake, suggested that she found the Theosophical Society. He told her that she would have to spend 3 years in Tibet to prepare her for the important task, and accordingly H.P. Blavatsky decided to accept the offer made to her, and shortly afterwards left London for India, presumably for initiation into the mysteries of the ancient wisdom religion. Now we know from Colonel Olcott's People from the Other World that in 1874 Madame Blavatsky's master, or control, professed himself to be the spirit of a bold buccaneer called John King, who flourished in the 17th century and amused himself in the 19th century by precipitating letters and fetching medals of honour from the coffin of Madame Blavatsky's father. Moreover, it was Colonel Olcott himself who first suggested that John King was no deceased buccaneer, but the creation of an order which, while depending for its results upon unseen agents, has its existence upon earth among men. It must have been shortly after this that the Kut-Humi delusion was born, for in 1879 we find him precipitating letters to Mr. Sinnett and instructing him in the elements of esoteric Buddhism, which was suddenly sprung upon the Theosophical Society and nearly caused a schism between its eastern and western branches. The Kiddle incident took place early in 1883, and Madame Blavatsky, now completely at liberty, set about repairing the breaches which Kut-Humi had made. The reminiscences contain an extract from the Path, in which 2 mysterious certificates are given having reference to the authorship of the secret doctrine. It is not very difficult to read between the lines of Dr. Hub Schleiden's account that Kut-Humi claims to have a finger in the pie. But the fact that Dr. Schleiden saw a great deal of the well-known blue Kut-Humi handwriting while the secret doctrine was in progress is by no means a proof that Madame Blavatsky was still under his influence. Every spiritualist knows that identity of handwriting does not necessarily imply identity of control. The whole affair is very puzzling, and it is doubtful whether even Madame Blavatsky herself could at all times distinguish between what was original and what was dictated, still less how far John King was responsible for the latter and how far the Mahatmas. When we consider, however, that one of the conditions on which her release from prison was obtained was that the Hindu brothers of the left, who wished to make use of her, should not interfere with anything that had already taken place, we can understand that the Kiddle fiasco would only have the effect of throwing her back on her original controls. She might still believe in the Tibetan source of her inspirations, and on this point she could not be undeceived, owing to the terms of the compromise, though it must have been gall and wormwood to her Hindu friends. Accordingly, it was only necessary for her to re-Christian John King and confer reverent rank upon the spirit of her old nurse Maya, known afterwards as Mahatma Moya, as Smith becomes Smith with an E when he rises in the world. How far Madame Blavatsky was herself responsible for this deception, or indeed whether she was responsible at all, it is difficult to say, and the question is still further complicated if we take into account the evident signs of dual personality which she exhibited. It needs no ghost or Mahatma to account, for example, for her sudden change of mind at Würzburg respecting Countess Weimeister's visit. Madame Blavatsky would have preferred her room to her company, but H.P.B. could not do without her. She had seen clairvoyantly a manuscript album in her possession and required it immediately. But let us set against all her tricks, conscious or unconscious, the story of the poor woman, and the steerage tickets related on page 147 of the Reminiscences, and remember that far worse sins than Madame Blavatsky was ever accused of were pardoned in one who, like her, loved much. R.I.P. The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harris. This is Lecture 2. An initiate originally meant one to whom instructions had been imparted which enabled him to penetrate the region of superphysical concepts which is hidden by a thin veil from the world of sense, and to distinguish between illusions and realities which, on the borderland, are in close juxtaposition to each other, and are for this reason a source of danger to the intellect. For to be incapable of distinguishing illusion from reality is to become insane. In ancient times there was no general diffusion of knowledge by means of literature. Even in Greece, literature played a very unimportant part in education and was confined to poetry and history. Instruction in science was oral. When committed to writing, it was always veiled in symbol, and the only exoteric science was mathematics. In Egypt, Chaldea, and India, there could be no conflict between science and religion, for their custodians belonged to the same class or caste. However repugnant to our modern notions of equality distinctions of caste may seem, they contributed powerfully to the stability of those ancient civilizations, which were in many respects far higher than our own. But in these days it is neither possible nor desirable to confine knowledge to a class, except a certain kind of knowledge, and this is, so to speak, held in trust for the benefit of all, and will be revealed when the times are ripe for imparting it to the world. Formerly every initiate was a member of an occult fraternity, who had gone through a regular course of instruction and discipline. But in modern times there are exceptions to this rule. Facilities are afforded in the present day for self-initiation, which in old times did not exist, and the esoteric fraternities have been compelled to recognize this fact and modify their rules of secrecy accordingly. By a very ancient rule, every initiate can claim to be instructed by a more learned brother when occasion arises for action on points where ignorance might prove a disadvantage to him, and I am glad to take this opportunity of testifying to the very generous way in which such appeals have been responded to in my own case. What, then, is an initiate in modern times as distinguished from the individual tried, proved, and admitted to instruction in the higher mysteries, which the term formerly connoted? An initiate is one who has crossed the threshold of the unseen, with or without help, has passed the dweller, resisted the temptation to remain with her, and, undeterred by that fear which the unknown always inspires, has made acquaintance with the region beyond, and reduced into order a set of experiences as wholly unfamiliar as is the world of sense to the newborn infant by the ordinary common sense process of intellectual classification. An initiate is not necessarily an adept. He may understand the relations between the seen and the unseen world. He may have threaded the network, if I may use the expression, of causes in the unseen which unfold themselves as effects in the world of phenomena, and yet be totally unable to control those effects, and would shrink with dismay from the responsibility of taking part in a strife the preparation for which requires years of training. Who, because he has learned to handle a pair of sculls on the Serpentine, would volunteer for lifeboat service in a storm at sea? Or, because he has witnessed the amputation of a limb by a skilful surgeon, should consider himself qualified to perform a similar operation, and resolve to handle the knife at the first convenient opportunity? Again, an initiate, or an adept either for that matter, unless he belongs to a certain class, is not necessarily a clairvoyant. A man may be able to read even though his sight may be weak, while the strongest eyes are useless to him who has not learned to read, or to whom the language is unknown. The mental sight of some adepts is actually weak, for adeptship is seldom attained without some loss of intellectual vigour, and they prefer to be read to, if I may be allowed the expression. To the uninitiated this may seem very fanciful and extravagant, but it is a fact that, among occultists, the really great intellects are content to serve and obey, and rarely aspire to become rulers and arbiters, and this is especially the case with the astrological orders who, from time to time, give the results of their observations, but advice never, or on very rare occasions, perhaps once or twice in a century. Once more, an initiate is a man who has learned a great secret which is of the nature of a paradox. It is dangerous to divine, but it is destruction to reveal. To impart it to the world would be madness, for it would have the effect of dividing humanity into Cains and Abels. To reveal it to an individual would be to put oneself in his power for life. It is the one secret that torture is powerless to extract, for in such circumstances the agony of revealing it under compulsion would put an end to the victim's reason and probably his life. Now, as these lectures are for the purpose of giving information and not tantalizing or mystifying, I will do my best to try and explain by analogy the nature of the strange experience to which I have referred. The most grotesque notions prevail concerning the dweller on the threshold, which probably have arisen from a too little interpretation of the experiences of Glindon in that magnificent allegory of Zanoni, or rather, let me say, since the author disclaims the term allegory on the ground that the characters are not personifications of abstract things such as virtues or qualities, that magnificent parable of human aspirations after the ideal. He admits, however, that beneath the narrative it relates typical meanings are concealed. He certainly did not mean that a veiled figure, whose eyes gleam with demonic fire, appears to be the actual sight, whether normal or clairvoyant. In the case of Glindon, it was the fiend of his own unholy desires which, in the light that flashed upon him at the instant of crossing the threshold, appalled him by revealing, in all its native hideousness, the close affinity which existed between the forces born of the corruption of his own lower nature and the destructive forces of the planet, constituting a fatal bond of attraction between himself and the evil ministers of disease and death. And then came the temptation which, in the words of Zanoni, it is forbidden the lips to repeat, the hand to record. It can, however, be illustrated by analogy. It is easy to cross the floor of a room between two parallel chalk lines 6 inches apart. It requires great courage and steadiness of nerve to cross a precipice on a 6-inch plank. The temptation to step off seems almost irresistible, and is described by those who have performed the feat as an instinctive effort to counteract the tendency to sway from side to side, which is the natural effect of rapid focusing and refocusing of the eye oppressed by the distant detail beneath. In the same way, the difficulty of distinguishing between illusion and reality, on the borderland of the unseen, tends to destroy the mental balance. The perception of hostile influences, whose nature is only revealed in the world of sense by their effects, in all their naked actuality, has, for him, whose lower nature is unpurified by discipline, an awful fascination. As a drowning man, the instant before unconsciousness sees the whole of his former life, as in a rapid panorama, pass before him, so to him who is crossing the threshold, every evil thought of which he is capable, whether translated into action or not, seems a cord grasped by hands eager to drag him into the abyss. There are no such cords, but the situation is one of intolerable horror when experienced for the first time. Presence of mind, however, is all that is required. Forewarned is forearmed, and the dweller on the threshold may be safely defied by him who nerves himself to disregard physical dangers which he perceives for the first time, but to which a moment's calm reflection will enable him to see that he has always been subject, without knowing it, and that the knowledge itself is no danger if he will only keep cool. But to lose one's head is to court destruction. Better to die of delirium tremens than come under the influence of the 1,001 illusory phantoms which beset the backward path into the world of sense. I was once persuaded by a young man, whose moral courage I thought could be relied upon, to impart certain instructions which, if followed out, would have enabled him to cross the threshold with safety. My last words to him, as I shook hands with him at the railway station, were, "Don't lose confidence in yourself, and bring your common sense to bear in distinguishing illusions from realities." I heard from him a few weeks afterward. At his very first supersensual experience, he dropped the whole thing like a red-hot coal, with the usual consequences: ridiculous phantasms, voices, apparitions, and what not. I wrote advising him to experiment no further, and resolving in my own mind never to take such a responsibility on myself again. Let those who wish to be instructed apply in the proper quarters. If they are in earnest, they will find out probably quite by accident. In concluding this part of my subject, I hope I have made it clear that the initiate is not necessarily a magician, a clairvoyant, a prophet, or even a teacher, for he may lack the ability to correlate accurately the laws which govern the spiritual region with those by which purely physical phenomena are regulated. But he knows the secret of the magician's power. What the clairvoyant sees he is able to read, and if he will take the trouble to work out certain problems, the data of which are furnished by his own actual experience, he can ascertain, after a little preliminary instruction in numerical symbolism, the relations which every visible effect bears to its invisible cause, and by applying to it the key of the three great axioms, traced its unfoldment in time with unerring accuracy. The three great axioms. 1. 7 is the perfect number. 2. The microcosm is a copy of the macrocosm. 3. All phenomena have their origin in vortices. These three axioms are the foundation of occult science, and are of the nature of universal truths, though not axiomatic or self-evident to the uninitiated, with the possible exception of number 2, just as axiom 9 of Euclid, "The whole is greater than its part," is as self-evident to the unreasoning dog, in the case of a biscuit, as to the reasoning man. I am not, however, concerned in defending their axiomatic character, but, on the contrary, propose to treat them as mere assertions, and inquire what could be said in favour of their probability. Is 7 the perfect number? Now, the whole tendency of modern thought is to recur to the archaic idea of a homogeneous basis for apparently widely different things. Heterogeneity developed from homogeneity, as in the search for protoplasm in biology. Protyle, the name given by Mr. Crookes to the hypothetical homogeneous substance of which the atom is composed in chemistry, and the force of which heat, electricity, light, and magnetism are the differentiations. The direction which modern science is taking is toward a generalization founded on the perception of a harmony of numbers throughout nature. So far back as the year 1844, an article appeared in the Medical Review, in which the writer asserts the principle of a generalization which will express the fundamental laws of all sciences by one simple numerical ratio, and goes on to say that from these, Whewell's philosophy of the inductive sciences, and Mr. Hayes' researches into the laws of harmonious colouring and form, it would appear that the number 7 is distinguished in the laws regulating the harmonious perception of forms, colours, and sounds, and probably of taste also, if we could analyse our sensations of this kind with mathematical accuracy. Again, there is a periodical septenary return of cycles in the rise and fall of diseases, and in the birth, growth, maturity, decay, and death of insects, reptiles, fishes, birds, mammals, and man himself. Dr. Laycock, Lancet, 1842-43, writing on the periodicity of vita phenomena, records a most remarkable illustration and confirmation of the law in insects. And, having given a number of illustrations from natural history, he adds, The facts I have briefly glanced at are general facts and cannot happen day after day in so many millions of animals of every kind, from the larva or ovum of a minute insect up to man, at definite periods from a mere chance or coincidence. I think it is impossible to come to any less general conclusion than this, that in animals, changes occur in every 3½ 7, 14, 21, or 28 days, or at some definite number of weeks. In regards to fevers, the same Dr. Laycock states that, whatever type the fever may exhibit, there will be a paroxysm on the 7th day. The 14th will be remarkable as a day of amendment, either cure or death taking place. If the 4th paroxysm be severe and the 5th less so, the disease will end at the 7th paroxysm, and change for the better will be seen on the 14th day, namely about 3 or 4 o'clock a.m., when the system is most languid. This law, he says elsewhere, binds all periodic vital phenomena together, and links the periods observed in the lowest annulus animals with those of man himself, the highest of the vertebrata. Now, if the mysterious septenary cycle be a law in nature, if it is found controlling the evolution and involution or death in the realms of entomology, ichthyology, and ornithology, as in the kingdom of the animal, mammals, and man, why cannot it be present and active in the cosmos in general? And why should not an occultist be able to trace the same law in the life of the solar system, the planet, and the races of men which inhabit it? The number 7 is the factor element in occult science and in every ancient religion, because it is the factor element in nature. And this brings us to the second axiom. The microcosm is a copy of the macrocosm. This is the law of correspondence, which is the foundation of the true occult science, or rather art, of divination by number, and is dependent on the septenary constitution of the universe. Every series of which 7 is the numerical ratio is a cosmos in itself, and is relatively great or small. The highest expression of this law is the individual man, who is the microcosm par excellence. Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man is, of course, purely fanciful. From birth to death there are only 5 periods: infancy, childhood, youth, maturity, and decline. Infancy, however, is preceded by a gestation period ending at birth, and decline is succeeded by a corresponding period of unconscious earth life, which begins with the death of the body and ends with a return of consciousness under totally different conditions. The corresponding macrocosm is the life of the nation, which, in its turn, is the microcosm of the macrocosmic race. Putting aside the 2 unconscious periods with which, for our present purpose, it is not necessary to deal, but which nevertheless have their analogues in nation and race, we find the same phenomena of birth, growth, and death repeated on a larger scale in the national life, as distinguished from that of the individuals of which the nation is compound. Let us take modern Europe as an illustration. With the exception of the Slavonic peoples, of whom we shall speak presently, and a small Turanian element which is too insignificant to deal with, the nations of modern Europe and their American and colonial offshoots represent the 5th sub-race of the great Aryan root race. In the days of the Roman Empire, these nations were in their infancy. Before the Roman conquest, Gaul, Britain, and Germany were not nations, they had only a tribal existence. Their conquest and incorporation into the Roman Empire marked the period of infancy. Roman law was their nurse and protector. To the nurse succeeded the tutor. The destruction of the Roman Empire and the rise of the papacy marked the period of childhood, or the beginning of their intellectual life. The period of youth, with its wider interests and enlarged range of vision, began with the Renaissance and ended with the Reformation. The manhood of modern Europe dates from the 16th century. We might pursue the analogy further, but the next period, the French Revolution, brings us too close to modern times to render it advisable at the present stage of our inquiries to dogmatize in regard to its significance. Let us turn to the Slavonic people, who belong to the 6th Aryan sub-race, and what do we find? A powerful empire which unites under a despotic government a number of local communes, Russia. The remains of a kingdom, Poland, whose only cohesive force is its religion, and which will be ultimately reabsorbed in the Russian Empire in spite of it. A number of tribes who, oppressed by the alien Turk, have thrown off the yoke and have been artificially consolidated into little states, whose independence will last as long as, and no longer than, the next great European war. What are all these but the characteristics of a sub-race in its infancy? Western Europeans are accustomed to speak of its barbarism, and in one sense they are right. Our civilization is a mere veneer on the upper classes, and is as much a foreign growth as Roman civilization in Britain. Their destiny is to evolve a higher civilization of their own in the future. The Russian Empire must die that the Russian people may live, and the realization of the dreams of the Pan-Slavists will indicate that the 6th Aryan sub-race has begun to live its own intellectual life, and is no longer in its period of infancy. We need not pursue the subject further than to say that the national character will enable them to carry out experiments in socialism, political and economical, which will present innumerable difficulties in Western Europe. The above are only given as illustrations of a law which is of universal application, and is known in occult science as the law of correspondence. It must be borne in mind that in occult science the deductive method is pursued for purposes of discovery, and the inductive for proof. We come now to the third axiom. All phenomena are the result of vortical action. What light can modern science throw on this? I have already referred to the tendency of modern science to seek for a homogeneous principle in nature, and to this hypothetical entity Mr. Crookes has given the name of protyle. Protyle is, so to speak, the stuff of which atoms are composed. Now, what is this protyle? Is it force or is it matter? If protyle be matter, it must be divisible, and to admit the divisibility of the atom is equivalent to an admission of the infinite divisibility of matter, which materialists are compelled to deny. Buchner, for example, says that to accept infinite divisibility is absurd and amounts to doubting the very existence of matter. The atom, then, is indivisible, but as Professor Butleov points out in Scientific Letters, it is also elastic. Quote, an attempt to deprive it of elasticity is unthinkable, and would amount to an absurdity. Absolutely non-elastic atoms would never exhibit a single one of those numerous phenomena that are attributed to their correlations. Without any elasticity, the atoms could not manifest their energy, and the substance of the materialist would remain weeded of every force. Therefore, if the universe is composed of atoms, those atoms must be elastic. It is here that we meet with an insuperable obstacle, for what are the conditions required for the manifestation of elasticity? An elastic ball, when striking against an obstacle, is flattened and contracts, which would be impossible were it not to consist of particles, the relative position of which experiences, at the time of the blow, a temporary change. In other words, elasticity can pertain only to those bodies that are divisible, and the atom is elastic. End quote. Protyle, then, is not matter, but is it force? Let us quote Professor Butleov again. What is force from a strictly scientific standpoint, and as warranted by the laws of the conservation of energy? Conceptions of force arise from our conceptions of this, that, or another mode of motion. End quote. It is the translation of one state of motion into another state of the same, but motion implies a something moved, and this something, as we have seen, cannot be matter, for the infinite divisibility of atoms precludes the possibility of conceiving matter as an objective reality. Protar, or the homogeneous basis of atoms, is, therefore, motion in an unknown medium, or pure objective force, and atoms are simple force centres. Is their motion vortical? Such, at least, is Professor Crookes' opinion. In an address delivered at Birmingham before the Chemical Section of the British Association, he calls attention to the existence of bodies, which, though neither compounds or mixtures, are not elements in the strictest sense of the word, bodies which I venture to call meta-elements. After giving a large number of examples of bodies, apparently the same, which yet when examined very closely were found to exhibit differences which, however imperceptible, still show that none of them are simple bodies, Mr. Crookes is obliged to find some means of reconciling the new discovery with the old periodic theory, which stands in the way of an unlimited multiplication of elements. Quote, "That theory has received such abundant verification that we cannot lightly accept any interpretation of phenomena which fails to be in accordance with it. But if we suppose the elements reinforced by a vast number of bodies, slightly differing from each other in their properties and forming, if I may use the expression, aggregations of nebulae where we formerly saw or believed we saw separate stars, the periodic arrangement can no longer be definitely grasped. No longer, that is, if we retain our usual conception of an element. Let us then modify this conception. For element, let us read elementary group, such elementary groups taking the place of the old elements in the periodic scheme, and the difficulty falls away. In defining an element, let us take not an external boundary, but an internal type. Let us say, for example, the smallest ponderable quantity of yttrium is an assemblage of ultimate atoms, almost infinitely more like each other than they are to the atoms of any approximating element. It does not necessarily follow that the atoms shall be all absolutely alike among themselves. The atomic weight which we ascribe to yttrium, therefore, merely represents a mean value around which the actual weights of the individual atoms of the element range within certain limits. But if my conjecture is tenable, could we separate atom from atom? We should find them varying within narrow limits on each side of the mean. The very process of fractionization implies the existence of such differences in certain bodies." End quote. He goes on to say that this deviation from absolute homogeneity will perhaps be clearer if we return in imagination to the earliest dawn of our material universe, and face to face with the great secret, try to consider the process of elemental evolution." End quote. The result at which he arrives is, as far as it goes, absolutely correct, and is a truly marvellous example of the direction which modern science is taking in the person of one of its highest representatives. It would almost seem as if the chasm between the superstitions of the past and exact science is about to be bridged over. In a lecture given a year later at the Royal Institution, he pictures the following. Quote, "The action of two forces on the original protyle, the one being time, accompanied by a lowering of temperature, the other swinging to and fro like a mighty pendulum, having periodic cycles of ebb and swell, rest and activity. But it is evident a third factor must be taken into account. Nature does not act on a flat plane. She requires space for her cosmogenic operations, and if we introduce space as the third factor, all appears clear. Let us suppose the zigzag diagram, Professor Emerson Reynolds, not drawn upon a plane, but projected in a space of 3 dimensions. What figure can we best select to meet all the conditions involved, inasmuch as the curve has to pass through a point neutral as to electricity and chemical energy twice in each cycle? A figure of 8, or lemniscat, fulfills every condition of the problem. If we project this figure in space, we find on examination that the points of the curves where chlorine, bromine, and iodine are formed come close under each other. So also will sulphur, selenium, and tellurium, again phosphorus, arsenic, and antimony, and, in like manner, other series of analogous bodies. It may be asked whether this scheme explains how and why the elements appear in this order. Let us imagine a cyclical translation in space, each evolution witnessing the genesis of the group of elements which I previously represented as produced during one complete vibration of the pendulum. Let us suppose the one cycle has been thus completed, the centre of the unknown creative force in its mighty journey through space, having scattered along its track its primitive atoms, the seeds, if I may use the expression, which are presently to coalesce and develop into the groupings now known as lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, sodium, magnesium, aluminium, silicon, phosphorus, sulphur, and chlorine. What is most probably the form of track now pursued? Were it strictly confined to the same plane of temperature and time, the next elementary groupings to appear would again have been those of lithium, and the original cycle would have been eternally repeated, producing again and again the same 14 elements. The conditions, however, are not quite the same. Space and electricity are as at first, but temperature is altered, and thus, instead of the atoms of lithium being supplemented with atoms in all respects analogous with themselves, the atomic groupings, which come into being when the second cycle commences, form, not lithium, but its lineal descendant potassium. Each coil of the lemniscate track crosses the same vertical line at lower and lower points. Dominant atomicities are governed by the distance, backward and forward, from the neutral centre line, monatomic elements being 1 remove from it, diatomic 2 removes, and so on. In every successive coil, the same law holds good." End quote. Is this a new discovery, or was it ever known before? One of the superstitions of the past was a belief in the magic virtues of the caduceus. The form was modified by the Greeks, but the original caduceus of Hermes, the Egyptian Thoth, the Hebrew Enoch, the greatest of the Hindu 7 Pitris or enlighteners, was a rod entwined by 2 serpents. Everyone knows the form of the caduceus, and what is it but a lemniscatory series? It was the symbol of magic or wisdom, because magic is that art by which man, recognizing the essential identity of his own spiritual nature with the forces that lie behind the phenomenal universe, becomes able to produce similar phenomena on a small scale. No one, says Madame Blavatsky, will deny that the human being is possessed of various forces, magnetic, sympathetic, antipathetic, nervous, dynamic, and mental, and that they are all biological in their essence, the physical intermingling with, and often merging into, those forces which we call intellectual and moral, the first being the vehicles, as it were, of the second. Their presence and commingling are of the very essence of our being. They are not suppositions and abstractions, but realities, and the only active realities whose attributes can be determined by direct observation." End quote. In spite of all atomo-mechanical theories by which scientific materialists hope to avoid the plain issue of the divisibility or indivisibility of the atom, the fact remains that the whole science of occultism is built on the doctrine of the illusory nature of matter. I have now dealt as briefly as possible with the 3 axioms, not of course with the idea of proving them, but for the purpose of showing that they possess no inherent improbability, inasmuch as they are supported by a large mass of evidence, and witnessed to by a large number of persons who would indignantly repudiate any atom to impose dogmatic utterances in the shape of axioms as a basis for scientific investigation. The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison. This is Lecture 3. It is related in the Talmud that Rabbi Eliezer ben Orkanaz, having replied unsatisfactorily to certain questions propounded to him concerning his teachings, The doctors present refused to admit his conclusions. Thereupon Rabbi Eliezer endeavoured to convince them of the truth of his doctrines by causing a carob tree to rise from the ground and transplant itself 100 cubits away, a rivulet to flow backward, and finally the great Baf Kol, or voice from heaven, to say, "What are the opinions of all the rabbis compared with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer?" Then arose Rabbi Joshua and said, "It is written, the law is not in heaven, it is in your mouth and in your heart." When therefore Rabbi Eliezer has proved to us that carob trees, rivulets, and unknown voices afford us reasonings equal in value and weight to that reason which God has placed within us to guide our judgment, then we will admit their testimony, and estimate them as Rabbi Eliezer requires. If this wise advice had been followed by Christians, much time and energy would have been diverted into more useful channels than profitless attempts to prove that the Christian revelation must be true, because our Lord and his apostles worked what are called miracles. These evidences, in quotation marks, of Christianity, as they are called, are not only useless but sometimes even mischievous, as for example the arguments from design, etc., to prove the existence of God. Their very plausibility was a real danger until the scientific doctrine of evolution revealed their superficial nature. Of course, God does not exist. He subsists, otherwise he would not be God. This, it may be said, is pantheism, but pantheism, like all other false or rather defective systems, is right in what it asserts, only wrong in what it denies, viz. Personality, which pantheists, who, like the man in the German proverb, are unable to see the forest for the trees, hold to be excluded by the doctrine of immanence. The doctrine of God's immanence in the cosmos is, however, essential to Christian monotheism, and has the authority of St. Paul himself, who made effective use of it in combating the agnosticism of the Athenian philosophers, which, like modern materialism, was based on atomo-mechanical conceptions, or rather misconceptions, of the universe. The great error of pantheism is that it takes the reflection of God in nature for himself, and thus lays itself open to the charge of atheism. Evolution, which is progress from imperfection to perfection, cannot be predicated of the divine being, who can never be otherwise than perfect. Of God, in his essence and absolute perfection, we can, and do, know nothing, but only his reflection in time, which is the medium of illusion. There can be no evolution of God himself, but our human conceptions of him, the cause, are, in themselves, of the nature of effects, and the effect is the unfoldment of the cause in time. But we may speak of the evolution of the God idea, or man's conception of him, which proceeds apace with man's own intellectual and spiritual evolution. Now, the God idea, like all other phenomena, is the result of vortical action, for the same law prevails in the intellectual and spiritual as in the physical world. This, however, requires explanation. How, it may be said, can ideas and spiritual concepts be spoken of in terms of motion? In this way our conceptions of force on the physical plane arise from motion, and motion is that which increases or diminishes the distance between one object and another. Now, as distance is a term which can be predicated of abstract ideas, the distance between love and hate, for example, we may speak of that which increases or diminishes the distance between separate ideas as motion on the intellectual plane. Accordingly, if motion in the physical world implies physical force, we may use the term intellectual force to denote that which causes motion in the world of ideas. Again, motion implies direction, which involves the idea of space, and time is, of course, an element in every conception. Given then time, space, and force on the mental plane, and vortical or any other kind of motion may be predicated of mental concepts. If, therefore, it be a universal truth that all phenomena are the result of vortical action, what may we expect to find when we endeavour to trace the course of the evolution of the God idea? And here it is necessary to call attention to one or two facts. I have said that the evolution of the God idea proceeds apace with man's own intellectual and spiritual development. God is that which we shall be eternally in process of knowing, and at every fresh stage former ideals of the Supreme Being appear grotesque, and we wonder how they can ever have been entertained by intelligent men. It is only necessary to refer to the horrible figment of Calvin and the 3 Lord Shaftesburys in 1 Lord Shaftesbury of the last generation, as examples of that fatal religious empiricism whose inevitable tendency is the establishment of a rival devil successfully disputing the divine supremacy. In considering, therefore, the evolution of the God idea, we must bear in mind that the thinking nations of the world belong to the Aryan or 5th period of this planet, corresponding to the period of maturity in the individual man, or the microcosm, and we may expect to find, therefore, that so far as God can be apprehended by the intellect, or 5th principle, man will attain to that apprehension before its close. The fuller spiritual apprehension of God requires faculties that are yet in embryo, and is reserved for future stages of man's evolution, when he will enter on the period of his decline of earth life and preparation for a higher consciousness. Let us see, then, whether the law of the double vortex, or lemniscate, holds good on the intellectual as well as on the physical plane. The diagram which follows will illustrate my meaning. Round the dotted figure of 8, which stands for the evolution of the God idea in the 5th root race, are 7 arrows, numbered 1, 2, 3, etc., representing the 7 stages of progression, and corresponding roughly to the sub-races. I say roughly because, for our present purpose, it is necessary to indicate these stages definitely, and it would land us in inextricable confusion if we endeavoured to trace the evolution of the good idea in any given sub-race without taking into account all the various and complex forces which go to form the intellectual life of the tribes and nations of which it is composed. But roughly we may say the 7 stages in the root race correspond to the intellectual growth of the 7 sub-races in their order. The black disc in the middle of the figure represents the neutral centre of ignorance, corresponding, in Mr. Crookes' scheme, to the point neutral as to electricity and chemical energy. The evolution of the good idea starts from this neutral centre, arrives at the same point halfway in its evolutionary course, and touches it again at its finish. But ignorance is of 2 kinds, the ignorance of hope and of apathy, and it is the latter which characterises the ignorance of the materialistic or 4th period. Intellectual materialism seeks to dignify it by calling it agnosticism, and even scientific agnosticism, which, if it mean anything, means that the ignorance of God is the beginning of wisdom. We shall, however, deal with this phase of evolution in its place. The arrows representing the 7 stages of progress point in their order to 6 asterisks, which indicate the prevailing religious tendencies of the respective periods. It must not, however, be assumed that the advance proceeds with unimpeded regularity. It resembles the ebb and flow of the tides of the sea rather than the steady progress of a river, hence the difficulty of assigning to any given sub-race a particular form of religion. A sub-race is composed of many nations whose intellectual life is dependent on so many and various accidents, such as geographical position, physical type and development, etc., as to preclude the attempt to label it with any approach to accuracy. Besides, the element of degeneration has to be taken into account. Degeneration is now a recognised fact in science, and as a writer in Lux Mundi has well observed, it acts more powerfully in religion than in any other region. Religion never rises above its last reformer until a new one appears. Take, for example, the period represented by arrow 4. it may be said to begin with the return of the Jews from captivity, and to be drawing towards its close at the present time. Before the captivity, nothing is more noticeable in the history of the chosen people than their strong tendency to polytheism. The reason is that they were surrounded by degenerate offshoots of the nations who had survived the periodical cataclysm which paved the way for the evolution of the fifth root race. In spite of the restrictions imposed on them by the Mosaic laws, marriages were, from time to time, contracted with the surrounded heathen. This hybrid element in the nation contributed powerfully to its degeneration, and the people, on whose life the fate of the whole race depended, were dying fast. The captivity was their salvation. For a time they ceased apparently to exist, but during that time a wonderful change was wrought. They came into contact with a still vigorous branch of the fourth root race, over whose intellectual life a wave of Aryan influence had flowed. It was about that period that the followers of Skaya Muni experienced a fierce persecution from the adherents of the unreformed Brahminism, which terminated in their expulsion from peninsular India. The votaries of Buddha fled eastward and northward, planting in some of the Hindu Chinese nations their religion under Brahminical forms, and in others engrafting their contemplative theism on the prevalent idolatries, for in Buddhism there has always been an esoteric and an exoteric doctrine, the former of which is capable of adaptation to any existing religious system. There can be little doubt they also fled westward to Babylon, for we recognize them in the Brahmani, of whom frequent mention is made both in the later philosophical and the ecclesiastical writings. St. Clement of Alexandria mentions Buddha by name as honoured by the Brahmani as a god on account of his virtue. Had they been adherents of the old Brahmanism, they would certainly have reported nothing good of Buddha. The captivity must have cut the Jews to the heart, as they sat by the waters of Babylon and wept when they remembered Zion. Their case seemed hopeless. But a remnant of the nation survived the fiery ordeal, and when, at the end of 70 years, they returned to the land of their fathers, every vestige of their old tendency to idolatry had been obliterated. Formerly they gravitated towards polytheism. Now their monotheism was ineffaceable. But, as I shall endeavour to show later, a distinct advance had been made during that period in the evolution of the God idea. The crude anthropomorphism of the pre-captivity era was modified by a pantheistic element of Aryan origin, which was subsequently engrafted on the old stock and bore fruit in the Kabbalah and Alexandrian mysticism. Understand, then, that though the God idea evolves through 7 forms in the fifth root race, and that they correspond roughly in their order to the evolution of the 7 sub-races, the former is an intellectual and the latter a physical evolution. The septenary law prevails on both planes, but it cannot be expected that all the laws which govern the intellectual region should correlate accurately with those by which purely physical phenomena are regulated. We shall endeavour, therefore, to trace the evolution of the God idea, with only occasional reference to the correspondence of its stages with the 7 sub-races. A glance at the diagram will reveal a rather curious fact, viz. That while arrows 1 and 2 mark a steady advance in the intellectual apprehension of God, arrow 3 seems to indicate a retrograde motion, for no one will deny that anthropomorphism is, intellectually, a distinctly lower conception of God than pantheism. The close of the second stage marks the period of the highest civilization in India, some thousands of years before the Christian era, and I've given it the name of esoteric pantheism, because while Brahmanism is a polytheistic religion for the multitude, it is founded on a philosophical system which is essentially pantheistic. Hitherto the evolution of the God idea has been a purely intellectual one. It was, so to speak, the discovery of God in his aspect of unconditional cause, but the personal and with it the moral element was lacking, and in order that the evolutionary track should not return into itself. An impetus in a fresh direction was necessary. It will be remembered that in Mr. Crookes' scheme, the lemniscate is projected in a space of 3 dimensions, the planes of the 2 curves not coinciding. To produce this figure it is necessary to postulate 3 forces, the centripetal and centrifugal for the curves, and a lateral force for their angular incidence. In the physical evolution of the elements, this third factor is represented by a lowering of temperature. Can we find anything corresponding to this in the evolution of the God idea? If the term intellectual temperature be admissible, does history point to any event which would seem to indicate such a condition at any given period? Now, whatever may be said in favour of the policy of isolation which was the keynote of the Mosaic legislative system, it was certainly not calculated to promote intellectual growth in the people who submitted to it. Material prosperity was the reward of obedience, and the punishment of disobedience was disease or destruction at the hands of their enemies. Of a future state, or life beyond the grave, they do not seem to have formed any idea in the pre-captivity era, and in later times the sect of the Sadducees appealed triumphantly to the law and the earlier prophets as affording no authority for the belief of the Pharisees in a spiritual world and spiritual beings. It seems, at first sight, curious that the people, on whom depended the intellectual and moral future of the whole race, should develop a civilization so grossly material. They carried neither science nor art one step forward. The second commandment throws up art, and all scientific inquiry was checked by the answer, "Things are thus and not so because Jehovah wills it." As to the wisdom of Solomon and the magnificence of the first temple, there can be little doubt that both have been grossly exaggerated. Otherwise, it is a most extraordinary fact that the Jewish nation over whom, but a few hundred years before, the mighty Solomon had reigned in all his glory, with a magnificence scarcely equalled by the greatest monarchs, spending millions of money on a temple, was overlooked by the historian Herodotus, writing on Egypt on one side and of Babylon on the other, visiting both places, and of course, almost necessarily, passing within a few miles of the splendid capital which, like the phoenix, had risen from its ashes. And if Solomon was remarkable for his wisdom, it must be remembered that, in his old age, he went after other gods and was probably initiated into their mysteries. How, then, was Jewish anthropomorphism an advance on Hindu pantheism? It was not an intellectual advance at all, but a moral one. For the first time in the history of the fifth root race, the idea of God was inseparably connected with the idea of righteousness, and the intellectual evolution received a temporary check from the lateral force of a spiritual revolution, the effect of which was to alter the angular incidence of the lower evolutionary curve. It was the revelation of the divine personality in its aspect of unity, and a preparation for the fuller revelation of the Word made flesh, and the Christian doctrine of the Trinity and Unity, which alone is capable of reconciling the seeming contradiction between immanence and personality. Thus the apparently retrograde movement was, in reality, a step forward, for while monotheism, in its lowest form of anthropomorphism, is scientifically grotesque, in its highest it has this advantage over pantheism, viz., that it is incapable of being defecated to a pure transparency. Monotheism, in fact, is a spiritual revelation. It is quite a mistake to suppose, with most theologians, that primitive man worshipped one God. Primitive material man worshipped the ghosts of his ancestors, and polytheism, as Mr. Herbert Spencer shows, was the next development. Abraham was the first monotheist, for the pre-Abrahamic period of Jewish history must be relegated to the region of symbol and myth, and to him, as the father of the chosen people, was imparted the revelation that there is one supreme God. But the revelation of his name was reserved for a later period, and was vouchsafed to a man better fitted by education to receive it than the half-civilized nomad chief. It was to Moses, learned in all the learning of the Egyptians, that God received his name of Yahweh, or Jehovah, which corresponds to the Hindu Mano Swamiyava, or self-existence, with this difference, that Yahweh involves the idea of personality. We learn from Exodus 5, verse 3, that by his name he was not known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The name, it is true, frequently occurs in the book of Genesis, but it is the opinion of Calmet and most other commentators that it is used there by anticipation. Now this marks a very important step in the evolution of the God idea. The name given to God by a nation implies the character of its own moral development, but this name being given to the Jews as a revelation involves, of course, elements of thought beyond what they had attained to. This name distinguishes the true God from all false ones. It is well said by Dr. Kay in Crisis Hapfadiania, in that oft-recurring phrase, Yahweh your Elohim. It is clear that we could no more transpose the words than in the expression, I am Joseph your brother. Yahweh, though etymologically signifying self-existence, yet, as being the personal name, gathered up into association with itself whatever attributes were manifested in God's condescending intercourse with man, especially therefore his righteousness, faithfulness, and mercy. But as the intellectual evolution from ancestor worship to pantheism was a gradual process, so also was the evolution of the idea of God's personality. Anthropomorphism was naturally the first step, and communication was always through the angel of Jehovah, of whom we shall treat further when we come to speak of the celestial hierarchy. The anthropomorphic element is, indeed, inseparable from the idea of personality, and its evolutionary culmination in the Word made flesh is a witness to its necessity as the means whereby man may be brought into his true relations with God. To this next development I have given the name Theomorphism, which marks the close of the fourth period, and this, as I have said, brings us to quite modern times. Theomorphism is the worship of the divine man, and here we find ourselves face to face with the difficulty before mentioned. It is almost impossible to correlate this period at all accurately with the history of the fourth and fifth sub-races. In what are sometimes called the Ages of Faith, when the fourth sub-race, or the Latin nations of Europe, were the leaders of religious thought, Christ was undoubtedly worshipped as God. But the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, apart from which Theomorphism would have no raison d'etre, was a dogma of the schools, and throughout the Middle Ages it manifested a constant tendency to degenerate into tritheism, which is a step backward in the direction of anthropomorphism. This tendency showed itself in the art of the period, in which God the Father is frequently represented as an old man with a flowing white beard, seated on a throne and holding before him the crucified Redeemer, while a white dove, symbolical of the Holy Spirit, hovers above. Degeneration reached a further stage in the spurious trinity of the Father, Mother, and Son, of which medieval art furnishes several examples. On the other hand, modern theomorphism inclines to the opposite extreme of a shadowy pantheism, and for this reason I have placed it midway between the fourth and fifth period. The fifth sub-race may be described roughly as the English-speaking people. Of course it contains fourth and even third sub-race elements, but few will deny that religious thought has shifted its centre of gravity in modern times, and that it is to English rather than Latin Christianity that we must look for further development of the God idea. The evolutionary tide wave has receded from the fourth sub-race, and the Latin nations of modern Europe exhibit a strong tendency towards scientific materialism, against which the Church, deprived of her former power and influence, can only feebly protest. But in England materialism has spent its force. the tide is advancing and has already checked the flow of the backward current. The tendency towards materialism, which 10 or 15 years ago characterized English science in the person of its highest representatives, is now a thing of the past. Huxley and Tyndall are no longer names to conjure with, and indeed aggressive scientific materialism may be said to have died with Professor W. K. Clifford. It must, however, be admitted that much of the current agnostic speculation on the existence of a first cause is still tainted with materialism. When Mr. Herbert Spencer defines the unknowable as a power manifesting through phenomena and an infinite eternal energy, it looks as if he were only able to grasp the physical aspect of being, or the energy of cosmic substance. That cosmic energy may have for its cause cosmic ideation does not seem to have occurred to him, and there can be little doubt that this one-sided mode of dealing with the problem is largely due to the pernicious practice of subordinating consciousness to the things of which consciousness takes account, and regarding it as a byproduct of molecular action. Be that as it may, it is beginning to be pretty well recognized in England and America that materialism has said its last word, and that if we wish for a satisfactory explanation of the universe, science must look in another direction. With the decay of materialism has disappeared much of that hostility to religion which, until quite recently, characterized the attitude of the leaders of scientific thought. On the other hand, the leaders of religious thought, in the Church of England at any rate, so far from regarding scientific discovery in the light of an enemy, are willing and even anxious to claim it as a friend and ally. With Christianity on its moral side, science has no quarrel, but as sacramentalism, or the recognition of the principle that the noumenon is the reality and the phenomenon the illusion, does not yet commend itself to the scientific mind as a working theory of the universe which, like evolution, may be a basis for a new departure in its methods of investigation. The claims of Christ to divinity are disregarded. Accordingly, we find that while the religion of the fifth sub-race is distinctly theomorphic, its science exhibits a strong tendency in the direction of pantheism. But the religious and intellectual evolution of the sub-race are both converging to the point of sacramentalism, and when that point is reached, and the pioneer of scientific sacramentalism appears, the fifth period of the evolution of the God idea will draw towards its close, and Christian pantheism will put an end to the conflict between science and religion, which has lasted so many centuries. Of the next development, or Christian polytheism, I propose to treat in the following lecture, which will deal with the celestial hierarchy. The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison. This is lecture 4. In the preceding lecture, I endeavoured to show how the revelation of the divine unity acted as a lateral force on the cyclic evolution of the God idea, projecting it in a fresh direction and round another centre. It started as a purely intellectual process, and the first coil of the lemniscate had for its centre the human reason. But the world by wisdom knew not God, and if further progress was to be made, a new centre was necessary. In the fullness of time, the divine man appeared. The God idea had evolved through the successive stages of polytheism, pantheism, and anthropomorphism, and had arrived once more at the neutral centre of ignorance. Now, whatever opinions may be held in regard to the person of Christ, whether he was divine, or human, or semi-human, or praeter-human, or, as the Catholic Church has always maintained, God and man, yet not two but one Christ, it will not be denied that his appearance in the world marked the close of one intellectual epoch and the beginning of another. Pre-Christian speculation about God was essentially teleologic. It was an endeavour to account for the existence of man and the phenomenal universe, and it reached its highest intellectual point in Hindu pantheism. But the moral element which, in modern times, is recognized as essential to the conception of God was conspicuous by its absence, and it was not until that period was drawing towards its close that we recognize in the writings of Plato the first shadowy indications of the necessity of a moral centre for any further development of the God idea, and of the existence of such a centre nature afforded no proofs. The neutral point of ignorance was again reached, and man was without God or hope in the world, when suddenly a great sign appeared. A man was born in an obscure province of the Roman Empire, who claimed to be himself that centre. We are not concerned at present with the defence of this claim, but merely point out that it has been found impossible to ignore it. The most liberal of modern thinkers shrink from charging with audacious imposture the founder of an ethical system which compels their admiration, and whose life was the highest recorded manifestation of the religious ideal. Accordingly, the ingenuity of those who are unable to accept his claims to divinity has been taxed to the utmost in the endeavour to explain them away. That he was a great moral teacher, no one denies, but that his person has a metaphysical and cosmical significance is an idea repugnant to an age so impatient of the supernatural as our own. But it has to be taken into account, and accordingly, the interest of modern physical inquiries into the laws of the cosmos, or the origin of man, is immediately heightened when these inquiries are suspected to have a bearing, however indirect, upon Christ's sacred person. The evolution of the God idea in the pre-Christian era, consistently with its teleologic character, had for its centre the human reason. But this is now felt to be inadequate to meet the altered conditions of the problem. So long as the evolutionary track was confined to the intellectual plane, the centripetal force of reason maintained the necessary equilibrium, but the lateral spiritual impetus introduced a new element, that of righteousness, as essential to the conception of God, and the centrifugal force of scientific inquiry, which would otherwise expend itself in a tangential direction in its endeavour to compass the infinite, is held in equilibrium by the personality of Christ. A personal centre has this great advantage, that its sphere of attraction is not limited to the intellectual plane, but is able to control the centrifugal force of speculation about God, whether it take a physical, intellectual, or moral form. Accordingly, under the Christian dispensation, belief in God may take any form that is not inconsistent with believing rightly the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ. And this constitutes the claim of the Christian religion to Catholicity. Belief in God can only take three forms: polytheism, pantheism, or anthropomorphism, and the doctrine of the Holy Trinity is alone capable of blending into a synthetic unity these apparently irreconcilable ideas. The worship of the man-god satisfies the anthropomorphic instinct, which differentiates religion from philosophy. The sacramental idea, which is involved in the doctrine of the Word made flesh, is essentially pantheistic, while polytheism, or the recognition of diversity and unity in teleologic research, is redeemed from the charge of idolatry, when the principle laid down by St. Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, is admitted that though there be gods many and lords many, yet for us there is but one God and one Lord. That is, all secondary causes have their origin in the one great cause, to whom alone supreme worship is due. It is with this polytheistic element in Christianity that we have now to deal, and it may be as well here to anticipate two objections that may be raised against the existence of any such element. The first is a religious objection, viz. That polytheism, or the recognition of inferior deities, even if such exist, is contrary to the spirit of Christianity, and is distinctly forbidden in Holy Scripture, inasmuch as it tends to obscure our relations to the supreme deity. There is much force in this objection. The danger was formerly very great and has not yet wholly ceased. Communion with higher intelligences may lead to the sin of adultery unless certain conditions are observed. As I am not writing for initiates but for ordinary Christians, I may as well say at once that they should never be approached except through the sacrament of Holy Communion or in terms officially authorized by the Church in the case of Roman Catholics. On the other hand, I may be allowed to point out that the question of a polytheistic element in Christianity is, at present, of scientific interest only. We have not yet arrived at that stage of the evolution of the God idea in which it will have a religious significance. The second objection is that the existence of inferior deities is a purely gratuitous assumption. Granted, it may be said, that the physical universe has its origin in that which is not physical, why should we seek to differentiate the unknown cause? The answer is because the logical sequence of analogies in the evolution of beings demands it. We are obliged to conceive of the supreme God on the one hand as a purely spiritual essence, exalted above all that is finite, and on the other as having a definite relation to the created universe. Now, creation involves intention, desire, thought, work, and these are properties that imply limit and therefore belong to a finite being. And, moreover, the imperfect and circumscribed nature of this creation precludes the idea of its being the direct work of the infinite and perfect. The solution of the problem lies in the Christian revelation of the Word made flesh. A revelation, as I have said, is the unveiling of a hidden truth, and that this is a truth is proved by the fact that on no other intelligible hypothesis can the existence of the universe be accounted for. Let us examine it. Of God's nature in itself we can and do know one thing only, that it is transcendent love. Now love is the manifestation of self to that which is not self. How then is the love of the Father revealed? In and through the Son, who, by manifesting in time, returns the love of the Father by revealing it, for otherwise the love of God will be manifest only to himself. The Son is therefore the cause of the universe, or as St. John puts it, all things were made by him, and in him was life. For the effect is the unfoldment of the cause in time. We may regard the universe then as a theophany, or the externalization of the divine love. The question then arises, by what process does the love of the eternal manifest in time? The life of the Word, says St. John, is the light of men. The Son, therefore, by limitation, becomes the divine reason or the connecting link between the relative and the absolute. In the Kabbalistic book of Zohar, the principle is thus formulated. All that is has its origin in the Ein Sof, or divine wisdom. But the idea is at first undeveloped. It lies enfolded within itself. When the idea begins to expand, it arrives at the degree of spirit. Then it takes the name of intelligence, or the reason of the centre, and is no more. As before, hidden, the idea has externalized itself. Accordingly, it is through the Seraphoth, or intelligences, that the Ein Sof issues ultimately in the plastic principle of the material universe. It is here that the polytheistic element in Christianity comes in, for the idea which is popularly held of creation as the making of something out of nothing is absurd and irreconcilable with the omnipresence of God. Matter is a mode of force, force is a mode of will, and will is a mode of intelligence. The Zephyrophal series of the Kabbalah, however, is open to one grave objection. It takes no account of the element of illusion which is necessarily implied in the theophonic doctrine, for the universe is not real because it is not eternal. God is the only reality, and the cosmos is a reflection of him, as it were, in a mirror. Pantheism takes the reflection for the reality and thus lays itself open to the charge of atheism. In dealing, therefore, with the process by which the eternal manifests in time, I prefer to adopt the Dionysian series, which not only has the advantage of being in accordance with Christian tradition, as probably derived from St. Paul himself, but meets all the conditions required. Dionysius the Areopagite, said to have been consecrated by St. Paul, Bishop of Athens, has always been regarded in the Christian Church as the great authority on the celestial hierarchy, and is referred to by Dante in his vision of paradise as Quel Ciro, che gusto in carne, pio adentro vida, la angelica natural el ministero. It is true that modern criticism assigns a later date to the writings which at one time were directly attributed to him, but this is of little consequence. Pseudepigraphy was formerly a very common method of embodying tradition, and there is no reason to doubt that the unknown compiler has fairly dealt with the materials of which he was in possession. In these writings we have collected and focused all extant traditions in regard to the celestial hierarchy, and the system thus elaborated is not only in harmony with modern thought, but does not run counter either to Holy Scripture or to the Christian view of the relations between God and man. According to the Dionysian scheme, there are 9 orders of celestial beings, and grouped in triads. They correspond to the Brahmanical trimuti, or elements in the developing process, by which the material universe was evolved out of pure spirit. First triad, seraphim, cherubim, thrones. Second triad, dominions, mights, powers. Third triad, principalities, archangels, angels. The first triad cannot properly be termed separate beings, but rather divine faculties or emanations. They correspond to the Adi Buddha of the Indian mystics, and represent the sum total of all the spiritual energy and wisdom in the universe. Just as the brain is the centre from which radiate numberless faculties, physical, intellectual, and aesthetic, so the seraphim and cherubim, and in a less degree thrones, must be regarded as the primal outward manifestations of the deity. They belong to the region of absolute consciousness, or duration as distinguished from time, for time is that which produces illusion. What we call the present is only a mathematical line dividing that part of duration which we call the future from that other part which we call the past. The real person or thing is for us composed of the sum of all its various and changing conditions as it passes through our plane of consciousness. No one could say that a bar of iron dropped into the sea came into existence as it left the air, and ceased to exist as it entered the water, and that the bar itself consisted only of that cross-section thereof, which at any given moment coincided with the mathematical plane, which separates and at the same time joins the atmosphere and the ocean. Even so, the sense of actuality which we derive from this succession of momentary glimpses of any person or thing is an illusion, for it is only, as it were, a cross-section of the reality. The seraphim, then, represent the divine love in its absolute consciousness, the cherubim, absolute divine wisdom, and thrones, the absolute divine sovereignty. The last in the series, thrones, connect the first with the second triad. It must be borne in mind that we are here dealing with modes of existence that are utterly transcendental, and accordingly, when we say that dominions are the first objective manifestation of the subjective divine sovereignty, and collectively the male principle of the cosmos, we must not be understood to mean more than they belong to the region of relativity, that is, they are existences on the highest plane of consciousness or pure spirit. Mights correspond to the Indian Mula Prakriti, which is primordial substance, or pure force on the plane of spirit. It is the noumenon of all phenomena on every plane of relative consciousness, and is, so to speak, the matrix or female principle in the universe, which is the fruit of the mystic union between Prakriti and Purusha, or pure undifferentiated spirit.
The last order in the second triad are powers. This, however, is a very inadequate rendering of the word, which denotes objectivity. They are the only ones in this group who, in any human sense, can be said to exist objectively, and are of two kinds: the powers of light and the powers of darkness. Of the latter I propose to treat in a succeeding lecture in connection with the origin of evil and the mystery of the eighth sphere. The powers of light are the Elohim, gods of the first chapter of Genesis, who speak in the first person plural, "Let us make man in our own image," and the seven spirits or breaths of God mentioned in the Apocalypse. They are, in a certain sense, the creators of the world, that is to say, the world proceeded from them, for, as we have seen, the idea which is popularly held of creation as the making of something out of nothing is absurd, if for no other reason than that it is inconsistent with the doctrine of the omnipresence of God. Each of the seven breaths is correlated to the sevenfold occult forces of nature operating on different planes of consciousness, and these occult forces are correlated in their turn to potentialities inherent in every human being, but of the nature of which the large majority of men are totally ignorant. I am precluded, however, for obvious reasons, from enlarging on this head. The creator of the material world was Yahweh or Jehovah, the Lord of Form, and here it is necessary to correct an error so widely prevalent that the very notion of its being an error will fill many people with astonishment. It has somehow come to be taken for granted that Jehovah is the first person in the Holy Trinity, and yet there is not the faintest shadow of authority for such a statement from beginning to end of Holy Scripture. St. John expressly states that by the Word all things were made. Our Lord said to the Jews, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day and was glad." St. John chapter 8, verse 56. Everything points to the fact that God always reveals himself, whether as creator, redeemer, or sanctifier, in, by, and through the Word, nor is it possible to conceive of any other way in which the eternal could manifest in time. The manifested Logos is called by the Hindus Ishvara, the Lord, or the highest consciousness in nature, and is a compound unity of manifested living spirits, plus their divine reflections on the plane of illusion. Thus it is that the powers of light, Maha-Buddhi, though one in their essence, as the manifested Logos, are reflected in time as seven, which emanate from and return into the Logos, each in the culmination of its time. Of these seven, Yahweh is the Lord of Form. The other six proceed over the evolution of beings who exist in what is called the region of Arupa-loka, or the formless. No further information on this head can be given, as such knowledge pertains to the higher mysteries, and can only be conveyed in words which, as St. Paul says, speaking as an initiate, it is not lawful to enter. As God by the Word created all things, so the Word by Yahweh created the universe of form, and revealed himself as man to man. In the book of Genesis, a clear distinction is made between the work of Yahweh and the work of the collective Elohim, and both are distinguished from Elyon, the Supreme or Most High. We read, Deuteronomy 32, that when the Most High separated the children of men, the Lord, Yahweh, took for his portion Israel, Jacob being the lot of his inheritance. The theophonic angel of the Lord was Michael, whose name signifies like unto God, and he was the Jewish national deity or Prince of Israel. And here we touch the fringes of a great mystery. Though our Lord Jesus Christ took not on him the nature of angels, yet in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead. Though raised far above principalities and powers, he manifests through them in virtue of that fullness. We may therefore regard him as displaying under the Jewish dispensation the activities which are represented by these celestial orders. St. Paul teaches clearly, Galatians 3, verse 19, that the law was of angelic origin, and Clement of Alexandria says, formerly the Word was an angel, but the Word has appeared, and that mystic angel is born, or has taken on him the nature of man. Of course, by the term angel, he means the theophonic reflection, and this brings us to the third group, principalities, archangels, and angels. Though the term angel more properly belongs to the lowest order of the celestial hierarchy, the ministering spirits and guardians of individuals, it may be, and in point of fact is, taken to signify all the spiritual beings of the third triad, for they are actual existences with intelligence and free will. They are neither pure undifferentiated spirit, nor, exalted though it be, is their consciousness absolute or unconditioned by time. The principalities, though collectively omniscient, are not omnipotent. Their willpower is irresistible, but, as we shall see when we come to deal with the principalities of darkness, irresistible will plus omniscience is not the same thing as omnipotence. The archangels are not omniscient, though their knowledge transcends all human conception, and by their wisdom the nations of the world are guided, each in its appointed order, fulfilling its part in the evolution, physical, intellectual, and spiritual, of the human race. But they have never fathomed the length and depth and heights of the manifestation of the divine love, and before the mystery of the incarnation they veil their faces and cry, "Holy, holy, holy." The angels are not omnipresent, for though they are not subject to the limiting conditions of space, their sphere of action is this world, and their office is the ministry to individual man of the divine love which embraces all creation. It will be observed that the functions of the third triad are inverse in the order of dignity when compared with the first. The highest divine faculty, love, is represented by the highest order. Seraphim, cherubim, or divine wisdom come next, and thrones of sovereignty last, whereas in the third triad, the angels or minister of love are the lowest, the ministers of wisdom are highest, and the ministers of will higher still. The reason of this is because they are existent beings. God, as we have said, is the one reality, and the cosmos is his reflection. Let me not be misunderstood, however. Reality is that which is, but the human criterion of reality is objectivity, and things are subject or objective according to our states of consciousness. The highest truths have, for those who can realize them, an objective existence. The grossest material forms have no existence for him who cannot perceive them. For us, the real is that which we can realize, or objective existence, and accordingly, the third triad is real in the sense of being objectively existent, and only unreal in the sense which it shares with all creation of being, not God, but his reflection in Maya, or the medium of illusion. I will now deal as briefly as possible with the functions of the third triad. Principalities may be described as the angels of periods. It is very difficult to convey a clear idea of the nature of their activity, but the task must be attempted. Every age has, so to speak, its own idea of zeitgeist. Now it is a commonplace that ideas rule the world, but it is not generally known that they derive their potency from the spiritual force which lies behind them and prepared the world for their reception. Was Luther the cause of the Reformation? In a sense, undoubtedly he was. But if Luther had been born in the 10th century, he would have lived and died as an obscure monk. On the other hand, the 16th century could not have passed without some great religious convulsion. Men do not cause the zeitgeist, they cooperate with it. All great movements in the external world are the results of battles fought and won in the spiritual region. A conflict in which innumerable hosts have been engaged finds its ultimate expression in half a dozen human organisms who, overshadowed by the victors, become the leaders of a new movement. Of this, however, I shall treat presently in connection with the archangels. To the order of principalities belongs the mysterious being called Satan, whom it is a mistake to confound with the devil. To this confusion may be traced the controversy as to whether the devil is or is not a person. Strictly speaking, the devil has no existence, in the sense that cold has no existence. It is the absence of heat. But to refuse to take account of the devil in theology is as unreasonable as to refuse to light fires in the winter, because science teaches that there is no such thing as cold. Satan, however, or the manifestation of the devil, is a personality and the usurping king of this planet. But he is not, as Milton taught, and it is generally supposed, a fallen archangel, like Beelzebub, Mammon, etc. We are expressly told by St. Jude that the archangel Michael recognized his superior dignity in that he dared not bring against him a railing accusation. Archangels are generally described as angels of races, but this gives us only a very imperfect idea of the functions assigned to this celestial order, which are not always subject to ethnic limitations. In what are called the canonical scriptures, only two are mentioned by name, Michael and Gabriel. The latter belongs to the theophonic class. But in the Book of Enoch, which is accepted as canonical in the Abyssinian Church, we find the names of several others, such as Phaneol, Soriakiel, and Raguel. And these are not angels of races, but of departments of human activity in all races. Thus Phaneol presides over repentance and the hope of those who will inherit eternal life, and Soriakiel over those who transgress the moral law. This is very curious and suggestive of the way in which God orders the unruly wills and affections of sinful men by the establishment of a spiritual hierarchy, with due relations of control and subordination, whose office it is to resolve into harmony the discords of the world, and in its entirety constituting what is called divine providence. Archangels are the Dian Chohans of the Oriental religious systems, and are of two kinds, the ascending and descending. The former are the advanced entities of previous great cycles who, having perfected themselves beyond the highest limit consistent with any given condition of planetary life, our own for instance, pass on to the Dianic Choanic condition. Others there are who, evolved out of the infinite womb of Prakriti, on the mother principle of nature, are coursing towards the outermost limits of existence. With this distinction, however, we are not now concerned, but with another, their division into good and evil angels, between whom there rages an incessant conflict. I have said that all great movements in the external world have their origin in the spiritual world, and that the conflict of ideas which marks the transition period between one historical epoch and another is, as it were, a copy of a battle already fought and won in the spiritual region. On such a transition period we have just entered. The reader may take the following facts for what he thinks they are worth. The year 1879 marked the close of an epoch in the intellectual life of Europe and America. In that year, the hosts of light, under St. Michael the Archangel, obtained a decisive victory over the hosts of darkness, led by Beelzebub and Mammon, in a series of battles extending over a period of 30 or 40 years. About the middle of this century, the fifth root race touched the point known to occultists as the point of physical intellectuality, or the lowest in its evolutionary cycle. Its upward progress, if it is to preserve its cyclic path, must be in the direction of spiritual intellectuality. It is very difficult to convey to the ordinary reader the meaning of these terms, which, it must be confessed, are rather clumsy. Physical intellectuality, however, may be described as the tendency to regard as unreal all that is incapable of definition and measurement by human standards. It is a period of limits and boundaries, of mechanical authority in religion, of atomism in science, and of individualism in politics. Spiritual intellectuality is all that physical is not. Freedom of thought and religion, pneumatism, if I may coin a word, in science, and socialism in politics. On this period we have, as I've said, only just entered. In the spiritual region the battle has been fought and won, but some years must elapse before its effects begin to show themselves plainly in the world. 2 men, however, have been born out of due time, and a third will shortly appear. John Worrell Keely in America and Tolstoy in Russia are pioneers of the dawning era, and both will share the fate of men born a century too soon, viz., obloquy, persecution, and failure. But he that hath ears to hear, let him hear. The trumpets of the archangels announcing their glorious victory over the prince of this world, whose second judgment or crisis is come. Yet a third, and he will be overthrown and bound for 1,000 ages. We now come to those beings properly termed angels or ministering spirits. This word ministering has given rise to some confusion of thought. An idea prevails that the angels are all our ministers or servants, but this is a mistake. Even the appointed guardians of individuals minister to God for us. They are called in the original serving messengers, and the adjective implies divine service. Our authorized version is also responsible for another error, viz. That the angels are pure spirit and also of a fiery nature. Angels are not pure spirit. They are spirit plus soul, and only one class can be properly called fiery. It all arises from a mistranslation of Psalm 104, verse 4. The proper rendering is, "Who maketh the winds his messengers, and flames of fire his servants." The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews has taken a clever advantage of the 70 version to press this text into his service. He cannot be accused of dishonesty, as the word angel signifies equally wind or spirit, and messenger is the same as messenger. The angels, then, are dual in their nature, as are all created beings except man, being spirit and soul. All creatures below man, whether animals on the material plane or those beings which we call immaterial, because the matter of which their bodies are composed is imperceptible to our senses on account of its tenuity, and which are known as elementals, are soul and body. Man alone is a trinity, or the image of God. It is sometimes been alleged as a reproach against the unfallen angels that they are will-less, but this is not strictly correct. It must be remembered that, as representatives to the individual of the divine love, which embraces all creation, they are spiritually automatic and cannot be otherwise without losing their purity. To this danger, however, they are in reality liable at a certain stage in their evolution, and when that moment arrives, their latent willpower will assert itself in a direction which cannot be named, as knowledge of this kind belongs to the higher mysteries. We have now to consider how far communion with the angelic host, or Christian polytheism, is lawful. In other words, may we pray to them without falling into the sin of idolatry? We may regard prayer as a form of spiritual energy, having an intellectual value and capable of being expressed in terms of will, as willpower is a form of vital energy, possessing a mechanical value and capable of being expressed in terms of motion. Now, the difference in the effects produced by a given quantity of energy on the physical and intellectual plane is apparent if we compare the value of a day's work by a bricklayer's labour and a man of science. In the same way, those who are acquainted with the laws of psychical dynamics know that the work produced by a fixed amount of energy on the intellectual plane is, in turn, enormously inferior to that produced on the plane of spirit. The words labore est ore, work and prayer, contain a profound truth. If, then, to pray is to labour on the spiritual plane, who can tell what results may not follow from communion with those unseen intelligences who, in the order of God's providence, stand in direct relation to the hidden forces of nature, and wield the powers entrusted to them in conformity with the divine will? if it be true that innumerable multitudes of angelic beings fulfill the commands of the Almighty as responsible agents in administering the affairs of this and other worlds, the great difficulty of reconciling prayer with the reign of law disappears. For, on the theory of the universe which we have been considering, law is not the result of blind, inexorable force, but of cosmic ideation. Prayer may be regarded, therefore, as the translation into willpower of spiritual energy, and is part of the machinery, so to speak, by which the universe is governed. Perhaps no kind of prayer has been the subject of more ridicule than prayers for rain or fair weather. But whom is it intended to crush? Children who pray that it may not rain on a holiday? No, thunder our scientific meteorologists, but the clergy of the Church of England, with the Archbishop of Canterbury at their head, who know, or ought to know, that the state of the atmosphere is regulated by laws which have no possible connection with the desires of any individual or set of individuals. But is this really so? We know very little of the laws which regulate atmospheric conditions beyond the fact that dryness and humidity in the air are caused by variations in local temperature, which in turn depend largely on terrestrial magnetism. But what is magnetism? A mode of energy. But willpower is also a mode of energy. Are our scientific men prepared to assert definitely the absence of any common value between the two, such as is admitted to exist between magnetism and other forms of energy, heat, electricity, etc.? Is it so very unscientific to believe that the desire of a whole community, concentrated on this particular object, may possibly liberate forces which may not be without influences on terrestrial magnetism, let us say by vibratory coincidence? Of course, in our present state of knowledge, or rather ignorance, of the laws of nature, they are not justified in assuming more than the bare possibility that such may be the case. But in the absence of any proof to the contrary, the charge of superstition cannot be maintained. Prayer, then, being the liberation of spiritual energy, it is a question not only of theological, but of scientific interest to whom should it be addressed. Let it be remembered in the first place that Christian polytheism, or the recognition of and communion with those gods many and lords many, who, like ourselves, live, move, and have their being in the great unconditioned cause, is not idolatry, so long as we maintain a firm grasp on the truths enshrined in the creeds. On the contrary, paradoxical as it may sound, it is really a safeguard against that sin. For what is idolatry but the rendering to another of that supreme worship which is due only to the holy and undivided Trinity? It has even been ruled irregular by several councils of the Church to address our prayers to Christ instead of to the Father by the Holy Ghost through Christ. This seems very strange to modern Christians, who are accustomed, for the most part, in proportion to their devoutness, to concentrate the whole of their devotion on the person of our blessed Lord. Indignantly as they would repudiate Sabellianism in words, it cannot be denied that many good people, in their anxiety to avoid the Arian Scylla, manifest a tendency in the direction of the Sabellian Charybdis. Be that as it may, angel worship is the traditionary antidote against anthropomorphism, which is not only a grotesque and degrading conception of the Supreme Being, but utterly incompatible with a right belief in the Holy Trinity. For the very highest conception that we are able to form in our minds of a great first cause falls immeasurably short of the real dignity of even an archangel, and to render divine homage to such a being is to rob God of his due. Are we then denied access to God the Father because our mental faculties cannot rise to the conception of him? 1,000 times no. Through Christ, who is the express image of the Father, we have this access in the sacrament of his body and blood. The more perfectly our human life is assimilated to the divine life, the more clearly will the Father be revealed, not to us, but in us. It is not intellect but love which reveals the Father, and in the filial love and obedience of the perfect Son, the revelation is full and complete. The ministry of his law is committed to the angels, the ministry of his love, which is himself, to his blessed Son. But if the angels are ministers of the divine law, we are surely justified in rendering to them that inferior homage which has always been claimed for them by the Catholic Church upon principles plainly elementary to the relations of one being to another. And if, as we have seen, prayer is the liberation of spiritual energy, communion with the angelic host, whatever form it takes, must resolve itself ultimately into the orthodox ore pro nobis. For as the operations of spiritual beings who are influenced by prayer are also on the spiritual plane, they will fall under the same category. Of course, there are dangers to be avoided. The pursuit of truth is ever attended with danger. But with our feet firmly planted on the rock of the creed, there is no real ground for apprehension, lest the contemplation of the celestial glories, which are revealed in the ministry of the angelic host, should so dazzle our spiritual vision as to make us forget that their exalted activities have their source in the Lord and Giver of life, to whom with the Father, the font of deity, and the Son, his express image, the one holy and undivided Trinity, is alone due the supreme worship of every creature.